The kitchen light was on. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. It was just past 2 in the morning, and the kitchen light was on in a way that meant someone had forgotten to turn it off, not that someone was in there. There's a difference. After 22 years of shift work at the mill in Kenora, you learn what an empty lit room feels like versus an occupied one. This room was empty. I set my bag down by the door and didn't call out. My daughter's bedroom door was at the end of the hall, and I could see from where I stood that it was open maybe 4 inches. She always slept with it closed. She'd been that way since she was 9 years old, after we watched a movie about a haunted house and she decided closed doors were safer. Even after she turned 17, she kept the habit. I walked to the door and pushed it open the rest of the way. The bed was made. Not slept in and remade. Made like it hadn't been touched. The decorative pillow my sister had given her for Christmas was still centered the way my girlfriend Renata placed things when she cleaned. With that particular hotel bed precision, Renata had picked up from somewhere and applied to everything in the house. I stood in the doorway for what was probably 30 seconds, but felt much longer. I want to explain something before I go further. I work up at the Dryden camp, 7 hours north of home. I'm a site foreman for a road building crew. We do 2 weeks in, 1 week out, which means I'm away more than I'm home, and I'd accepted that as the shape of my life after my wife passed. My daughter, Ava, was 11 when her mother died. She and I figured out how to be a family of 2, and then 3 when Renata came into the picture 4 years ago. It wasn't always smooth. Ava was 16 by then. She had opinions. She had grief she hadn't finished working through, and Renata had a way of being right about things that could feel like a wall rather than a door. But we were managing. Or I thought we were managing. I came home 4 days early because the camp got shut down for a drainage inspection, provincial order. They boozed us out on a Tuesday afternoon, and I didn't bother calling ahead because I wanted to surprise Ava. She had a chemistry exam that week, and I knew she'd been stressed about it, and I thought I'd take her to the Tim Hortons on Matheson Street and buy her a breakfast sandwich and sit with her while she studied. Renata wasn't home either. Her car was gone. I called Ava's phone. It rang through to voicemail, which wasn't unusual at 2 a.m. I called again. Voicemail again. I sat down at the kitchen table and told myself to wait until morning and not spiral. I didn't sleep. By 6:30, I'd called Ava's phone 4 more times. I texted. I called her friend Jess, who I had saved in my phone from when Ava had forgotten her own phone at a lacrosse tournament 2 summers ago. Jess picked up on the second ring, groggy and confused, and said she hadn't seen Ava in almost 3 weeks. 3 weeks. I'd spoken to Ava on video call 12 days ago. She'd been sitting at the kitchen table, in this kitchen at this table. She was wearing her green hoodie. She had her textbook open. She said she was fine. She said school was fine. She said Renata was at her pottery class. I stared at the phone after I hung up with Jess and tried to account for 12 days in a way that made sense. Renata came home at 8:15. She pulled into the driveway and I watched through the front window as she sat in the car for almost 2 minutes before getting out. She didn't know I was there. When she came through the front door and saw me at the table, she stopped moving in that particular way people do when they've been caught thinking they had more time. I asked her where Ava was. She said it in a voice that was so reasonable, so prepackaged, that I knew she'd rehearsed it. She said Ava had been struggling, acting out, that she'd done some research and found a program, a residential program, up near Sudbury called the Clearwater Youth Development Centre. She said Ava had agreed to go. She said it would be good for her. She said she was going to call me and explain. She just wanted to wait until Ava had settled in. I asked how long Ava had been there. 18 days, she said. I asked who had signed the intake forms. She said she had. I want to be clear about something. I am not a man who shouts. My father shouted, and I made a decision when I was about 14 years old that I would not be that man. But there are different kinds of anger. The kind I felt sitting at that table wasn't hot. It was very cold, and it sat behind my sternum like a stone, and I was aware of it the way you're aware of something structural shifting inside a building. A sound you can't quite place, but that tells you something load-bearing has just moved. Renata was not Ava's legal guardian. She was my girlfriend. She had no authority to sign anything on Ava's behalf. Ava was 17, not 12, and even at 12, it would not have been Renata's call to make. I asked Renata to give me the address. She said maybe I should let Ava finish the program. She said she thought it would be better for everyone. I said, give me the address. She wrote it down on the back of a hydro bill envelope. I took it and walked out the door. It's a 6-hour drive from Kenora to Sudbury in good conditions. I drove it in 5.5. I stopped once for gas in Espanola, and I called my brother-in-law from the parking lot, my late wife's brother, a man named Conrad who lives in Thunder Bay, and who has always been steady in the way I try to be, but sometimes can't manage. I told him what I knew. He said he was getting in his truck. I told him I didn't need that. He said he was getting in his truck anyway. The address Renata gave me was a gravel road off the highway, maybe 8 kilometers into the bush. The sign at the entrance was small and wooden and said Clearwater Youth Development in green paint. There was a chain-link fence, a gate that was padlocked. I sat outside the gate for a few minutes. I am not someone who acts without thinking. My wife used to say that was both my best quality and my most infuriating one. She wasn't wrong. I drove back to Espanola and I called a woman named Barbara Osei, who is a family lawyer in Kenora. I'd met once at a town council meeting about the mill expansion. I had her number because she'd given a short talk about estate planning and I'd taken her card thinking about my will. I left her a voicemail at 9:45 in the morning explaining the situation in as much detail as I could. She called me back in under 20 minutes. She asked several questions. She asked whether I had sole custody. I did. My wife and I had both named me as primary guardian in the event of her death, and it had been formalized through the courts in 2019. She asked whether Renata had been granted any legal guardianship. She had not. She asked whether Ava had been assessed by a physician or social worker who had recommended residential care. Not that I knew of, she said. Don't go through the gate without me making a call first. I waited in a Tim Hortons parking lot in Espanola and ate a sandwich I didn't taste. Barbara called back 40 minutes later. She'd spoken to a paralegal at a firm in Sudbury who had some history with Clearwater. She said she had some concerns. She told me to go back to the facility and ask to see my daughter. She said if they refused, I was to call the OPP immediately and give them her number. The man at the gate was heavy-set, wearing a gray fleece, and had the kind of face that looked like it had never been surprised by anything. I told him my name. I told him my daughter's name. I told him I wanted to see her. He said visiting days were Saturdays. I said I understood that, and I wanted to see my daughter today. He said that wasn't how the program worked. I said, I'm her father, and I am her legal guardian, and I would like to see her now, or I'm going to call the Ontario Provincial Police and we're going to sort this out from there. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he went inside a small booth and made a phone call with his back to me. Then he opened the gate. They brought Ava to a room that had a folding table and 4 chairs and smelled like floor wax and something underneath the floor wax that I couldn't name. She came in through a door on the far side, and she was wearing clothing I didn't recognize. Not her clothes. Someone else's hand-me-down tracksuit, dark blue, a size too big. Her hair was pulled back. She looked thinner than when I'd last seen her, and her hands, when she reached the table, were rough in a way that her hands had never been before. She was a kid who'd spent her life doing homework and going to lacrosse practice and scrolling through her phone like every other teenager in Ontario. Her hands had no reason to look like that. She saw me and stopped walking. She said, "Dad?" the way she said it. Not like a greeting, like she was checking whether I was real. I said, "I'm here, sweetheart, I'm right here." She crossed the rest of the room and I stood up and she walked into me and she was shaking. Not crying, shaking. Like her body had been holding something and suddenly didn't have to anymore. When she pulled back, she looked at me and said, "They told me you agreed to this. They said you signed something. They said you knew." I told her I had not signed anything. I told her I had not known. I told her I found out this morning. She looked at me for a very long time. Then she said, "Can we leave?" I said yes. I said we could leave right now. The man in the gray fleece appeared in the doorway and said Ava had a program contract and that there were legal considerations around discharge. I said I was Ava's sole legal guardian, that no one had authority to enter her into any contract without my knowledge or consent, and that we were leaving. He said he'd need to make a call. I said make as many calls as you need. I'll be walking to the parking lot with my daughter. I want to tell you what the drive away from that place felt like, but I'm not sure I have the words for it exactly. It was quiet. Ava sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window, and after about 10 minutes she said, "How did you know?" I said her bed was made. She looked at me. I said, "I came home in the middle of the night and your door was open and your bed was made and I knew." She didn't say anything to that. But after a while she reached over and turned up the heat a little because it was a cold October morning and she'd been cold since I picked her up, and that small normal thing she did, adjusting the heat, made me feel like something was beginning to come back into order. Conrad met us at a motel in Sudbury. He brought food from a diner, the kind of enormous plate of eggs and toast that you don't argue with, and he sat with Ava while I made calls. I called Barbara Osei. I called the OPP non-emergency line and filed a report. I called the Clearwater facility and formally demanded Ava's intake file and any documents bearing my name or signature, and I was transferred 3 times before someone told me they'd mail the paperwork. I want to tell you what was in those files, because I think it matters. The intake forms listed me as having been contacted by phone and having provided verbal consent. There was a handwritten note on the admissions sheet that said "Father aware and in agreement. Contact attempted prior to intake." Renata had signed as a secondary guardian, listing herself as my common-law spouse. We were not common law by any legal definition in Ontario, where you need to have cohabited for 3 years or have a child together. We had been together 4 years, but she'd kept her own apartment for the first 8 months, which pushed us just under the threshold. The facility director was a man named Walsh. I'm using that name because it came up in the OPP investigation and then in the CBC story that ran the following March, and then in the court proceedings. Timothy Walsh. He had operated 2 similar facilities in the previous decade, one in Northern Ontario and one in New Brunswick. Both had been shut down following complaints. In New Brunswick, a family had sued over a child being kept in isolation for 6 consecutive days as a behavior management technique. He had moved on and opened Clearwater. There were 9 other kids at Clearwater when Ava was there. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 9 other children whose parents either didn't know where they were or had been misled about what the program involved or genuinely believed they were helping and had no way of knowing what happened after the intake forms were signed. The OPP investigation took 4 months. Barbara Osei connected our family with 3 other families in that time. One from Timmins, one from London, one from just outside of Ottawa. All of them had similar versions of the same story. Struggling child, a referral from somewhere, a website, a counselor, a Facebook group for parents of difficult teens, an intake process that felt professional and reassuring, and then silence from their kid that was explained as part of the program's no-contact protocol. I did not know there were Facebook groups for parents of difficult teens until I found out someone in one of them had posted the Clearwater link. Renata had found it there. She had been in that group for over a year without my knowledge, cataloging what she considered to be Ava's problems, collecting opinions from strangers about what should be done about a child who was not hers to make decisions about. Ava, for her part, was not fine. She is not fine in a simple, neat way that resolved itself because I drove 5 hours and picked her up. That's not how 18 days in a place like that works on a 17-year-old who was already carrying grief from losing her mother. She came home and she slept for approximately 14 hours, and then she woke up and ate cereal and watched television and cried twice without explanation, and then stopped crying and asked if she could call Jess. We did therapy, not a program. A therapist in Kenora who Ava chose from a list, who she saw every Tuesday afternoon for the first 8 months, and who she still sees now, less frequently. I took a leave from the camp for 3 months. I used vacation time I'd been accumulating for 6 years. My supervisor in Dryden was a man who'd known my wife, and he didn't ask questions. Renata moved out while Ava and I were still in Sudbury. She left a note on the kitchen table. I've read it twice, and I won't describe what it said, except to say it was the note of someone who had constructed a story in which they were trying to help and been unfairly cast as the villain. People do that. I understand it even if I don't accept it. What I can tell you is that Renata was named in the OPP report as having misrepresented herself in the intake documentation. The file was referred to the Crown. She was charged with 1 count of public mischief. She took a diversion program. I found that out from Barbara Osei over the phone, in the parking lot of a superstore in November, pushing a cart full of groceries, because Ava had asked if I'd make the chicken soup my wife used to make, the one with the barley. I stood there in the parking lot with that cart and I thought about what accountability looks like. I thought about whether what Renata received was enough. I still don't have a clean answer to that. I think about it sometimes. Timothy Walsh was charged with fraud, breach of trust, and multiple counts of unlawful confinement. The trial ran for 8 days in March. I was not in the courtroom every day. Ava needed me present at home for some of it, and I chose that, but I was there for the verdict. Guilty on all major counts. He was sentenced to 4 years and banned from operating any youth-related program or facility in Canada. I stood outside the courthouse in Sudbury in March, the kind of wet cold that gets into your jacket in a way the dry cold doesn't, and I called Conrad. He was in his truck, doing a load between Thunder Bay and Winnipeg. I told him the verdict. He said, "Good." I said, "That was most of the conversation. I want to say something for any parent listening to this who works away from home. Something I've thought about a lot in the time since. You leave because you have to. because the bills are real and the work is where it is, and you do not have the option of being present every morning at the kitchen table. I know what that costs. I know what it looks like on your kid's face when you leave again, even when they're too old to say it out loud. I know the way you check your phone on breaks at the camp, looking for a message, telling yourself no news is good news, while knowing that's sometimes just the story you need to get through the day. No news is not always good news, and the people you trust to be present in your absence are not always who you think they are. I'm not saying don't trust people. I'm not saying don't build a life. I am saying, know the names of your kids' friends. Have their numbers. Know the name of the school guidance counselor. Know what your kids' hands look like. I know what Ava's hands are supposed to look like. That's how I knew. It was a Thursday in February, cold and clear, one of those Kenora winter days where everything is white and still and the sky is the color of old tin. Ava had an afternoon off school, a PA day, and she'd been at Jess's house in the morning. She came home around noon and I had the soup on the stove, the one with the barley, the one her mother made. She came into the kitchen and she stood there for a second, and I could see her registering the smell of it. She sat down at the table in her coat and she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Is there enough for both of us?" I said there was plenty. She unzipped her coat and hung it on the back of the chair, the way she's done since she was a small kid who couldn't reach the hook by the door. She pulled her textbook out of her bag and opened it on the table, the way she was doing the night I called home on video, 12 days before I found her bedroom empty. I put a bowl in front of her. She looked at it. She looked up at me. She said, "It smells exactly the same." I said I'd tried. She picked up the spoon and she ate, and I sat across from her, and for a while neither of us said anything else, and the kitchen was warm, and that was enough.